program briefing, and there was, were you there? No, you with the glasses. Was it you that was there? Somebody, there were three of us who came from the community. And we were invited to sit at the table?
No, it wouldn't be me.
It wasn't you, okay. Okay, so we sat at the table, instead of listening, we sat at the table and participated, and I was,
I do remember.
right, so I was completely, right, no, well, she was one of the people running it with Maureen. So I was really impressed because Jae had all this information that I was very interested in at his fingertips and everything. So when the time came to pick or to ask somebody to speak, we asked Jae to come and talk to everybody about his experiences and to give his talk. So I'm going to shut up and sit down, and away you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm Canadian, but I left 18 years ago and moved to Europe to work in sustainability because there was a lot more going on. In the European continent, I'd say on average, they're about 15 years ahead of where we are in Canada. And I set up a company called Carbon Free Group after running a clean tech support program for the European Union in the UK. We had a bunch of businesses that were doing really exciting clean technology, renewable energy, sustainable construction, architecture, design, planning, and we formed ourselves together into a consortium. And it's all about delivering best practice, sustainable living today as cost effectively as possible. Basically, it's about saying, we need to make sustainable living easier than conventional living. We need to make it cheaper than conventional living. We need to make it so that people automatically do good instead of doing bad. And so I set up an event series called Sustainability Explored, run over 100 of them over the last 10 years. And this is one of the conversations I do a lot of talking around, which is sustainability still an option, or is it now a necessity for business? For many people, that's a pretty obvious answer, but for others it isn't. So what I'm going to be doing here is going through a process of talking you through global macro trends and how they all relate to sustainability in one way, shape, or another. I will unfortunately depress you as well, because it's an inevitability when you look at the truth that we find that things are often not as they appear. And also this is about looking at the deeper philosophies and politics of what's going on. And at the very end I built you back up again. So don't leave halfway through. Now, many people have seen this hockey stick graph. This is basically showing from the 1850s all the way up to 2000s. Most things are doing the same, logarithmic growth. And it doesn't matter what you look at, if it's fisheries exploitation, foreign investment, GDP, water use, CO2, everything from population to average global temperatures to loss of rainforests and extinction rates. Every single major indicator on planet Earth is doing this. And what's really interesting is we live in a fixed resource-based planet. There is only so much of everything. And perpetual growth is only present within a few things in nature. And those things are weird things, like cancer, like viruses. They keep going until they exhaust their resources and then they collapse. What's really, really interesting is cancer, if you break it down as a communication problem, the cells that get cancer lose the ability to communicate with those around them that are telling them they've grown to the right size, they need to stop. And they continue growing, they continue using resources, and they continue to kill the healthy cells that exist around them. That's why cancer is dangerous. Interestingly enough, that analogy is exactly what the human race is doing. We have all of the feedback loops, all the information telling us right now, stop. This is a good indicator, stop. I believe in perpetual growth. There isn't one economic leader in any business or any large government on the planet Earth that believes perpetual growth is a problem. They all buy into it, even though the only place this goes, every single time you look at it in human history, is down. Now, can any of you name an empire that survived in the planet's history? One. Just give me one. Which one? Empire. British, Byzantine, Aztec, Mayan, Mongol, Chinese, whatever empire. Yeah.
Well, the Mayans are still there.
Well, they still exist, but the empire's gone. And what's really interesting is how throughout human history, every single large, medium, and small empire has died. There are only a few micro-empires that have survived. And those would be in places like Micronesia. There's a couple of small island nations that are still functioning after 1,000 years. The Aboriginal Australians, the longest standing people in the world, 50,000 years, and they continue to function to one extent or another. But every major empire usually dies because of one of two reasons. Either they get beaten up by someone with a bigger club, the Greeks with the Romans, or more often, they overexploit their resources, and then they fail. And what's really interesting here is every one of our empires, every country on Earth, every company on Earth is overexploiting the resources. So we, for some reason, have bought into this illusion, this fallacy, that this is able to continue. I find it funny on so many levels how basic this is. This is 1 + 1 = 2. But we still think, no, 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 we'll be different, we'll be fine. Like every other empire in the planet's history who said, we'll be fine. And they're all gone.
That's the next generation's problem.
It is, ironically, yes. But what's funny is if you collectively look at the human race's efforts right now, we're obliterating the next generation's opportunities. Which is funny because the central premise behind human existence is generally to reproduce. So those two things are contravening each other. I mean, one of the things I love to say is the evidence doesn't support the hypothesis that humans are evidence-based decision makers. we're rational. As David Suzuki said, if you were to get 100 PhDs and sit down with them and present them with evidence that showed that their belief system that they learned was inaccurate, because the evidence is now showing that this is the case, 95% of them would continue believing their old belief system because they're not actually scientists. We're not rational. Look at the planet Earth right now. Look at Brexit, look at Trump, look at the fact that it's taken us 30 years to even begin to do anything about the biggest threat on the planet, climate change. We're not apparently managing the situation very well. Now go into some lovely indicators which back this up. We have a 50% predicted loss in biodiversity over the planet Earth in the next 80 years. This means half of all species on the planet will be gone. This is insane. We are committing a great extinction right now. And we're still messing about on the edges. But what I love to also point out is that 99% of all species that have ever existed in the planet's history are extinct. Extinction is normal. Survival is rare, very rare. And survival only occurs in the very rare species that understands adaptability, flexibility, and the ability to change its behavior if it threatens its own existence. We don't possess that right now, currently. The human race has no future with our model, at all.
Can I leave now?
Yeah, we can. World population 7 billion, we're going up to 9 by 2050. So we're just gonna have even more mouths, even more Gucci shoes, even more eBay, even more Facebook, more of the same. We're just gonna continue. But the thing is, all the extra humans are just ravishly devouring every square meter of resources on this planet. We have CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere indicating that we're already committed to at least 0.5 meter of sea level rise. Ironically, when I wrote this slide 2-3 years ago, that's what it meant. Today, it's more like 1 meter. Things are getting worse faster. Now, just to put things in perspective, 0.5 meter of sea level means every single alluvial delta on the planet Earth is gone. Alluvial deltas are where we grow 35% of our food. Can you see some little basic metrics adding up here? How are we planning on feeding ourselves? Because the basic sea level rise is going to take out a vast majority of our most productive fertile land. It's all right, we'll build Site C, it'll be fine. Take out a million-person food production capacity, and by the way, BC Hydro did not use food analysis in its risk assessment whatsoever when they decided to build it. Because it doesn't matter to them. They're using a broken model. So this alone should be shocking us into action. What's ironic is in the UK, we did an assessment and found that a 0.5 meter sea level rise will bankrupt the United Kingdom. There is nothing they financially could do to survive just the impact on their economy from that loss of land. That's inevitable now. We have In the past 30 years, coral reefs have shrunk by 38%. This is one of the beautiful ironies, and I'm sorry I have to use beautiful because I have learned to laugh at ourselves, because it's the only way I can continue working in this field, is just enjoying the travesty of the insanity, because coral reefs are where the vast majority of our food stocks from the ocean start their life cycle. They are the nurseries. And what's happening is the oceans grow, we're ironically having less and less food in the oceans. Great Barrier Reef, single largest life form on the planet Earth, will be gone. It will be completely dead in the next 30, 40 years. It's an incredible thing. I've been there. But what the Australian government's done is it's come down on all of its people who say anything negative about the Great Barrier Reef dying. They think that's how you manage the situation. Shut everybody up. Now, if we burn the world's proven fossil fuel reserves, we'll likely raise global temperature by 6 degrees Celsius. Basically, this is one of the most important ones. We cannot use 2/3 of all fossil fuels that we've already found today. If we have any attempt and belief in the 2 degrees Celsius maximum temperature rise that the world's talking about, which, by the way, we don't. No country significantly is taking these issues properly. There's the odd one. Canada's got some nice new lofty goals, but at the same time, we're pushing through CO2 emitting systems that are going to lock us into 50 years worth of resource problems. So, as Trudeau said, we can have windmills and oil pipelines. If he thought windmills were what we're doing, that's fine if he wants to mill grain, but they're wind turbines, they're a different thing. You cannot have wind turbines and oil pipelines if you want to hit any of the targets that we've agreed to, if you want to comply with any of the things we've committed to in the international stage. We don't have the choice. It's either or. Either you do CO2 reduction or you don't. You can't do halfway. It just doesn't work. Most countries are doing halfway. They're trying to please both sides. And if 2/3 of all fossil fuels can never be used, that means that every single oil company and natural gas company on the planet Earth should be downrating its value by 66%. That would bankrupt every single fossil fuel company in the planet Earth. It would wipe out most pension funds because we're invested in that. So we're in a unique position, and this is one that I find really intriguing, where we cannot burn the fossil fuels if we want our civilization to survive, but if we don't burn the fossil fuels, we're going to bankrupt ourselves. Welcome to a conundrum. We have no choice but to invent our way out of this mess. We have no choice but to create brand new systems of management, of value, of economics. Ironically, capitalism is completely compatible with a sustainable future. We've just unfortunately all chosen one version of it, which is incompatible. There are thousands of versions of capitalism, and it's about understanding value and what the true cost is. 1 liter of gasoline does not cost $1.25. It costs about $9 to $10 worth of impact. But if most of that cost is externalized in the natural environment and none of us pay it, this is what happens. This is a failure of management. That's all it is. There's no technical challenge with solving these problems. There is absolutely no reason why we don't solve these problems other than we haven't developed management systems that are capable of dealing with the worst aspects of our species. And that's a choice. And this is a choice we've collectively been making for so many years that we've created this. And that gives me hope, because it means that humans, once again, will be forced into a place of necessity. Necessity is the mother of invention. And when we are down on our knees, us humans get very creative. We solve problems. That's why wartime is the time we have the most inventions. We are in a war. We're in a war with ourselves. But we just don't realize it yet. We got a planet, and we think we can just keep doing this. Perpetual growth, it's fine. And that's sustainable. Whereas, in fact, it isn't. Right now, we're consuming 3.5 planets worth of resources every single year. Now, imagine you're a business. I like to use the business analogy. Say you make 50 pounds or 50 bucks a month, but you spend 3.5 times that each and every single month. What happens to you?
Go bankrupt.
You do. You go bankrupt. Under modern global accountancy laws and regulations, the planet Earth is technically insolvent. Now, this is a really interesting concept that most people don't even seem to be aware of. I worked in accounting firms in the UK talking about this message, and what was funny, I'd yet to meet one accountant anywhere who had even figured that out. Our financial leaders need to be taught how to count again because they've lost their way. They've learned to externalize so many of the important variables that they don't realize that you have to start thinking differently if you're insolvent. If you were a business and you continue to behave like the planet Earth is right now, or our countries are right now, you would be brought into administration. And ironically, that's what we need. We need to set up a system that forces us to be in administration. Take away the leadership from who is leading things right now and force it to change. So we're overdrawn 2.5 planets. She's great. I love that jacket. That's quite nice, isn't it? It's not from the Nook, by the way. Here's a little analysis on world water. The vast majority of the planet's water is salt water, and we've got a small amount, roughly 3% fresh water. If you break down that 3%, most of it's polar ice, and there's a little bit left in the ground, and that's the teeny weeny little bit that is in the rivers and lakes. Now, many people are aware of the fact that water is the next big resource challenge that we have. That summer we had the other year with that drought, wow, that's becoming more normal, isn't it? Did anybody hear that the North Pole right now is 21 degrees Celsius above average temperature? Hello? It is above zero at the North Pole right now.
What about the South Pole?
The South Pole is also experiencing radical shifts, and these shifts are happening faster than anybody ever predicted. Having worked in climate science for 15 years, having worked on the all-party parliamentary panel on climate change with the best scientists in Europe about climate change, they're terrified because the 1%, worst 1% analysis they ever thought we're exceeding every single year. We have to create a brand new norm for analysis because our top 1% is not good enough. Things are accelerating so fast that it doesn't matter what Trump or Trudeau believe. It doesn't matter what our corporate leaders believe. It doesn't matter what any normal person believes. This stuff is going to come so hard and so fast at us that there are going to be vast impacts. And this is the challenge we've got here. Are we as a species designed to handle this threat? It doesn't appear so. It takes 100 liters of water to make a cup of coffee over its entire life cycle. 1,600 liters, 1.6 tons of water to make a baguette. 16,600 liters to make a kilogram of leather. Or 72,000 liters to make a microchip. Each one of you right now has a couple of 100 tons of water embodied in your phone. Feels a little different now. These are things we don't even think about. How many phones have you had in the last 10 years?
Can you explain that a little? Like,
This is in the processing, getting the resources, the minerals, all the things out of the ground, getting them into a refined state, and then manufactured into an end product. There is so much water that goes into the processes. And for instance, coffee, of course, is getting the seeds, planting, raising, processing, all that other stuff. But it's interesting because the amount of embodied water in electronic gear is gigantic.
Never think of that.
Well, you wouldn't think of 1.6 tons of water in a baguette either. You know, it's really interesting. Here's an assessment that was done by Accounting for Sustainability. It looked at the global GDP at this time, which was $63 trillion. Okay? And what it says, how much of global GDP is based on natural capital? Nature provides the underlying value. 81% of all wealth on the planet Earth comes from nature, 19% comes from humans. What's interesting is our entire financial system is designed so that this erodes this, destroys this. So we will, for instance, when I was doing my undergrad in the 90s and looking at Clayoquot Sound, we were logging a river valley to get $6 million worth of trees and taking out a creek that produced $3.5 million worth of salmon every year. One-time logging, forever fish. Logging industry, much more powerful lobbyists than the fish industry. So we make a really stupid, irrational decision, financially irrational decision, because of that mechanism. That's an example. Destroying nature in order to create human capital. David Suzuki has a beautiful line, which is modern economics is mental illness. I would agree. It is completely insane to do such acts like that. But we do. This is a really interesting graph. The greatest threats around the world. This was analysis done in 2015. And they asked people, what do you think is this greatest, most dangerous thing? Now, pink is ISIS. Okay? Climate change is blue. Economic instability is green. Russia scares some countries over here for obvious reasons. China scares a little bit of regions over here. And Iran scares some areas over here. So there's some localized, this is all really localized stuff, which is I'm scared of my neighbor, the big club concept of ending empires. Yeah, there it is, which you can understand. But here we are in the affluent, well-educated, informed West, thinking ISIS is the most dangerous thing. It's incredible, because ISIS has killed how many Westerners versus a little thing called climate change? Right now, there are over 600,000 climate refugees pouring out of Africa into Europe. Those numbers are going to go up to 10 million a year in the next few years. This is the beginning of a massive piece of instability. The European Union, unfortunately, and I'm a big fan of it, I don't know if it has a chance for surviving this, because it doesn't possess the mechanisms to deal with such a magnitude of challenge. And we're over here going, oh, we're scared of some terrorists somewhere. Ironically, the United States, 600,000 people were killed last year from handguns. Terrorists killed a total of around 142 people. So number one threat for the Americans should be handguns. Or how about car accidents, 220,000 people dying? Or how about family members killing you? About 100,000. Or actually chairs. 15,000 people died from chairs failing underneath them in the US. No, it's terrorists. So humans are ridiculous. We have to just know that about ourselves. It enables us to potentially laugh our way to sustainability. Once you let go of this faith-based belief system we have and these moronic governance systems we have, which then it becomes a little easier. So these are some things that are quite interesting. The changing environment, every organization needs to know how it will be affected by climate change across its whole value chain. This is what I've spent the last 15 years doing, is in big corporates, helping them understand the threats and the risks from climate change to their value chain. I was working with a very large seafood producer in the UK, and they were suddenly running into big challenges with prawns. They would pre-purchase thousands and thousands of tons of prawns from Indonesia, and then at the last minute they'd get a call saying, sorry, we can't comply with the contract, we have to pay out our defaults. And they kept finding out why. Well, because local Chinese companies were coming in and buying it out and paying out the default too. They were offering them more money. So this seafood company said, look, we're gonna have to buy these farms. It's the only way we're gonna be able to manage our supply chain. And what was really interesting is I was doing the analysis with them and saying, well, 0.5 meter of sea level rise, what's it gonna do to most of these farms in Indonesia? They're wiped out. They have no chance. And they're the, oh, okay, so how many years left? What, we get 15? And that's the analysis, that mechanism, saying, yeah, maybe you probably could get 20, even 25 if you spend more money on it. But what was interesting is we started looking at alternatives to prawns. Crayfish can be swapped in for prawns in any mixture, like a prawn cocktail, up to 60% by volume without affecting the flavor whatsoever. Crayfish grow everywhere. They're really cheap and they require no effort. So they started to transition towards crayfish in their prawn cocktails. And then they decided to make it a big deal about this and saying, we're doing this because of the environment, because it reduces prices, because it's more sustainable. And they increased their sales by 400%. They made a huge amount of money. They managed a big risk, and they actually decreased their exposure to the prawn situation phenomenally. That's what this is all about. Smart business. This is about sustainable business is just business common sense. It's just we don't have any common sense anymore. Rising costs, we all need to know how our activities are and will be affected. So what's going to happen when the world goes up to $100 a ton carbon taxes, which it will happen regardless of whatever our own individual countries or parliaments think, because the whole planet's transitioning towards this. This is something I found really strange about coming back to Canada, is this ignorance here that the rest of the planet's getting on with it, and it doesn't matter whether we believe it or not. Alberta is the first place on the planet Earth that people are going to stop buying oil from. So build another $5 or $7 billion pipeline is rather stupid. Because guess what? Purchasers will go, I'm not buying that. I'm cutting down. And China, by the way, 2 weeks ago, announced the cessation of construction of over 200 coal power plants that were already being built. They said, actually, no, stop. We're not even going anymore. We're not even going to build them. They're adapting so quickly to this, whereas we're spending 20 years on infrastructure projects that are obsolete. So we need to understand that. Reputation, the link between environment and reputation is strengthened. Society is now beginning to drive a need for environmental disclosure. As I said, we're 15 years behind. If you were sitting in rural France or in Germany or in Denmark, right now your psychology around sustainability and climate change would be very different, because everywhere around you will see it. Every supermarket, every product you buy, every message coming out of every business is around this. Here, oh, let's pipelines, don't worry about it. We haven't caught up yet, and we're going to have to quickly because we're really exposed. And investors have been very slow to recognize the need for firms to manage their sustainability, but they're now asking for better and more consistent reporting. This is beginning to really take off. A lot of businesses are now starting to do different risk assessments. They're starting to understand that this goes to a lot deeper level. And PepsiCo had a really interesting experience a couple of years ago. There was a large typhoon that hit Queensland in Australia, and it wiped out the sugar production. Now, Queensland was a very large global producer of sugar at that time. So PepsiCo said, okay, we've lost 27% of our sugar requirements. We now need to go to our secondary and tertiary backup suppliers. And they went out and found the sugar. So they had no problem. But what they found is one of their third level suppliers backup was Queensland. So it wasn't really a backup. Then they decided to do some scenario planning. What would happen if we were unable to get that sugar? And we were therefore unable to make the Pepsi, and therefore unable to meet our contractual obligations. It was 18 months to bankruptcy for Pepsi. And they didn't realize that they had this massive risk that they were taking that was down to a weather system. And those weather systems are getting more active, more aggressive, and more dynamic all the time. So now, Pepsi has changed its entire sugar procurement mechanism so that it always procures a maximum of 10% of its sugar from any specific region in the world, and it diversifies. It's to protect itself. Zurich Insurance no longer insures anything in the South Pacific Islands. Nothing. No life, no cars, no houses, because of climate change. Micronesia, sorry, we won't touch you. Because they're gone. Doesn't matter what happens, the sea level will take out these countries. So they have made that decision, and ironically it's the insurance industries that are the cleverest about this because they're exposed to risk. They understand underwriting. So they're already backing away. You're going to see over the next 20 years, big insurers walk away from coastal property. You're going to see lovely West Van houses that can't get insured because the insurers will just say, forget it. It'll be a couple of big events before that happens, but they will happen. So how many of you live high up above sea level? Company governance. Government cannot micromanage the way an economy addresses all aspects of the environmental challenge, and as a result, there will be greater emphasis placed on business management to take responsibility. This isn't going away. This is not a fad. Now, there's 5 stages of corporate responsibility maturity. We have deniers, where short-term interest is the focus. Greed is good, Gordon Gekko School of Management. We have compliers, people who basically think the potential cost to profits is larger than the cost of compliance, so there's a motivation for change. Basically, they do what they have to do. Make me comply, I'll do it. Then you have risk mitigators, not migrators. They believe that preventing a problem is more profitable and better business than reacting to a problem. Preventative health, preventative medicine, preventative business. They think ahead. Then we have opportunity maximizers. They move beyond risk mitigation, and seek to minimize negative social, environmental, and economic impacts and to maximize positive impacts, including developing new business opportunities. These are organizations that are understanding there are vast opportunities in climate change. One of the examples of this would be Unilever. Unilever is the world's largest commodity supplier for the food industry. Now, Unilever has a very simple goal. Paul Pullman, the chief executive, said we are going to be the most sustainable large business on the planet Earth. Not number 2, not number 3. We're cutting our carbon emissions by 50% by 2025 while doubling the size of our company. So that's a 75% cut. He's committed to it and said there is no maybes. This is 50% drop in the impact of every single thing they sell. What they have found out, which is really interesting, is shampoo. Now let's cut the impact of shampoo over its whole life cycle. Well, 7% of the impact of shampoo comes from shampoo. 97% comes from the hot water. How do you, as Unilever, deal with that 97%? It's outside of your control. It's in people's homes. So now Unilever's like, well, let's develop shampoos that don't need water, which they did, and they've got them, but the customers of the world aren't buying waterless shampoo. It's stuff you rub in your hair, you wait until it dries, then you shake it all out, and it falls out like dust. And it works perfectly. It's been used all over the world for remote communities and for space station and blah, blah, blah. They've been using this for a long time, but
Kids are using it. The teens are using it like crazy.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the trend right now.
It is, but the average person isn't really comfortable with it yet. So Unilever said, okay, do we need to actually start selling solar hot water systems for houses? So we have to start helping people develop their hot water in their house better. Oh, that's a bit difficult. So what they decided is, okay, shampoo, we're kind of stuck. So that means another thing we sell, we're going to have to drop by 95% to make up for what we can't do with the shampoo. But what I love about Unilever is they're being completely transparent about the fact that they've been unable to manage some of these things. And they don't have the faintest clue how to solve some of the problems. But they're still sticking to the global commitment. That is leadership. And then we have champions, a vision of what a truly sustainable organization is, who is intent on changing the game. Commercial strategy is sustainable strategy. You do not have a sustainability team. The chief finance officer is the sustainability guru. They are one. And that is very, very rare. But this is where the climate change billionaires are going to exist. This is where the vast volume of businesses will get exposed to huge risk and collapse. We will see huge bankruptcies. Lots of businesses die because they're incompatible with the world that's changing. Anybody know what that is? Not many people ever get this. It's only been guessed twice in about 50 presentations. So. It's a spinneret gland on the back of a spider.
Oh.
Okay, so this is how the spider makes silk. The reason why I use this image, if you have arachnophobia, it might wig you out a little bit, but what's interesting is the spider silk is pretty strong, pretty tough. Every one of us has walked through a spider's web and gone, wow. What's really interesting, the closest material humans have, other than some very rare elements, but mainstream elements, would be Kevlar. Kevlar is about 70% as strong as spider silk by weight. So it's not even as strong as spider silk. Now, Kevlar is made by boiling petroleum products in sulfuric acid at 1,000 degrees Celsius under 30 times atmospheric pressure. Spider silk is made by eating bugs. When you look at the energy in, energy out equation, spiders are 10,000 times, not 10,000%, 10,000 times as efficient at making that thing than we are. Biomimicry is what this is about. How do we learn from nature? Nature's been running a multi-million-year R&D program. There's no HR department to complain to in nature. Nature is brutal. It basically, you either make it or you don't. And so every single thing we see in our environment made it. It made it by figuring out how to optimize itself in the circumstance it was in. So we as humans have massive opportunities to learn by mimicking nature, by learning how nature builds things, how it constructs, how it takes apart, how it uses resource. We are the only species on the planet that creates waste products that are useless to everything, including ourselves. Most people will go off when they're in town at lunchtime, go grab a sandwich that's in a plastic container, eat it, throw it away, and there's 3,000 years of a piece of plastic sitting in the environment. We don't even think about it because it's cheap. We could make that plastic container out of starch, which is made from potatoes or corn, but that costs an extra 2 cents. And we gotta be cost effective. Because we've externalized all the real costs, we say that that's cheaper. It's not cheaper. It's the most expensive thing we can do. That's the ironic fact here. A lot of people say renewable energy is too expensive. No, it isn't. Subsidization of fossil fuels is 8 times what renewables are globally. Every single time you pay money out, you're buying gasoline for your car, that fuel is massively subsidized by our taxes. And then we say, oh yeah, but renewables is too expensive. It's because we're not subsidizing it. If we had flipped those subsidies, renewables, actually ironically, in 40 countries around the world are already cheaper than fossil fuels with no real subsidization. It is just a matter of time before we're gonna have renewable systems on the roof of your house that cost just as much as your roof does anyway. You're gonna have energy stored in your house, in your car. You're gonna have your house talking to your neighbors and sending power back and forth. That's something that I'm working on right now in the UK is 47 carbon positive houses. Carbon positive, by the way, means houses that produce more energy than they consume in a year. They export power to the grid. They are beneficial to the environment for existing. Not net zero, which is what people are aiming at. I want to have no impact. No, I'm sorry, we got to do positive impacts. What's really interesting is those houses cost about 7% more than conventional houses, but they'll pay you around $8,000 a year for all the excess energy you make, which means they have a payback period. A normal house doesn't give you that. It just gives you exposure to cost. So these things are here now. It's already ready. Biomimicry is a really interesting field. There are so many incredible presentations about this concept. Really recommend you look at them. Now here's the Stern Review for the economics of climate change. Stern was an economist that the UK government hired to say, look, can you quantify the difference between adapting to climate change or preventing climate change? Now Stern did a pretty good assessment. What he basically found was, guess what? Preventing it is 20 times cheaper than adapting to it. Preventing a fire from starting in your kitchen is better than repairing the fire after it's happened. Well, it makes sense, really. So the British government used this as the foundation for a lot of their climate action. And the University of Leeds Center for Low Carbon Futures did an assessment on cities with the Stern Review. And what they basically showed was if a city were to invest 2% of its GDP each year into carbon reduction for 10 years, it will generate an annual savings of 2.2% every year. What that means is a CO2 reduction of 40% in the city in 10 years. You have every billion invested, 220 million every year of value, resulting in a payback of just over 4 years. This is not complicated. This is really easy. It's very simple. This is basic business common sense. So you can demonstrate that investing in low carbon measures is not only cost effective, but also results in very commercially attractive return on investment. Here's some favorite quotes. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man or woman. It is time to become incredibly unreasonable with the insane management systems that we've grown to accept. And be these societal, economic, environmental, every one of them we need to be questioning. You cannot see the future with tears in your eyes. Beautiful Navajo proverb. The key point there is do not move from ignorance into desperation. You have to go into action. And yes, you have to be honest and aware of the nightmare we're in, but you can't do anything if you just sit and wallow in despair. The point here is get up, do something. The most powerful thing any of you can do is with your pocketbooks. It's what you buy. You give money to companies that do horrible things, you help them, you facilitate them. If you bank with a bank that is supporting oil or extractions, our Royal Bank of Canada, most of the other big banks in Canada, pull your money out of them and put it in a credit union. Do not facilitate these people. Put your money in places where the businesses are doing things that solve our problems. Do not create them or exacerbate them. For an organization to survive, its rate of learning must be at least equal to the rate of change in its external environment. Reven's Law. That's a really powerful one. I've now got 4 boards, including Anglo-American Mines, now has one of its directors in charge of Reven's Law. So this guy has to report on this every board meeting. At every board meeting, he says, we're nowhere near it. We're failing still. But at least they're reporting on it. At least he's got resources to look at it. And what's really interesting is since he started looking at it, they've now, as a board, come to a position where they now understand there's a big risk that they were taking that they didn't know, which is the worst risk of all. So when you find yourself in a dangerous circumstance you didn't know was there. So at least they now know it's there. And if you really think the environment is less important than the economy, try holding your breath while you count your money. Guy McPherson, that is such a good quote. The environment matters a lot more than our money. And that's a thing that most of us don't remember. We need to. Thank you for your time.
Do you have time for some questions?
Absolutely. Yeah. Any question? Yes.
I'll start with, I've got 20, but I'll just give you the start with. Helen Caldicott, economist from Australia, was sounding the alarm many years ago about, infinite growth in a finite sphere.
Yep.
You're saying economists simply don't grasp this. What's going wrong? Why is that correct, or is it just a small that message is still not being heard?
Well, having taught at Cambridge, at Birmingham on their MBA program, and now teaching at UBC on their MBA, I will say that my experience within academia is that universities still are teaching the old business models. Most of our accountants, our business students, our economists are learning the same thing they did 25 years ago. Most haven't even adapted to the recession that hit in 2008. So yeah, we're unskilled. What I spent a lot of time in the UK was trying to convince the Institute of Chartered Accountants to integrate life cycle assessment and whole life costing into the training of accountants, and they refused to because they said no one's asking for this. So what we have is the next wave of professionals coming through who don't have the faintest clue. They're not exposed, they don't know. And the other big challenge we've got is the vast majority of leaders in business and government have spent 25 years playing games to get there, and they're good at those games. And most of those people actually are in a position where they say, I didn't need to know any of this stuff to be successful, so I don't really believe it. That's the challenge. The other big one is government. If you've ever worked in government, any of you? Well, oh gee, if you've got an entrepreneur mind, you take a risk and it succeeds, you get this. If it fails, you get this. The feedback loop is 100% incompatible with innovation. Government management systems have no chance in innovating themselves out of these messes. They're just not designed for it. They need adaptability and flexibility, which anybody who works with government knows that's the last thing any of them have. We have lobbying systems that manage the way our politicians think, which have no compatibility with our desires as the population. So, yeah, no, we're not training anybody this. And economists buy a collective lie. They believe that it's all fine. I mean, it's really interesting because if you go back to the foundations of modern economics, the Milton Friedmans, if you look at the actual thinking behind them, these people were actually saying that in a given circumstance, these are the ways to manage it. They were not saying this is the way to manage it forever. They were saying in the given circumstance. So if you had the founders of modern economic thinking available today, many of them would be going, this doesn't make any sense anymore. We need to change because there's new variables. But we get locked into belief systems. We have a sort of a fanatical belief in governance systems. So yeah, we're not trained. We're not, largely irrelevant. There's a group called the Finance Innovation Lab in Europe that is looking around alternative ways of managing finance, and it's full of accountants and economists who get it. And on average, they say 1% of their peers in their field are open to these different ways of thinking. So if you go to the Canadian Chartered Accountants, you'll ask them, and they've got the sustainability team, and it's tiny percentage of accountants pay attention to that. And if you look at ecological economists, it's a sub-branch of economics. Ecological economists have been screaming this stuff for 30 years. They've been screaming this stuff way before the recession hit. But because they get $50,000 a year instead of a stockbroker at $1 million, nobody listens to them. It's a weird hierarchy we've got. So it's not that the knowledge isn't there, it's just not penetrating average decision-making frameworks.
Question. So you mentioned, when you talk about the economy, you have governance, business, manufacturers, and education of these organizations and the models that they use. And then you also spoke about voting with your dollar, spending with your dollar, which is consumer inputs into the economy. Has there been any impact studies about looking at the model of consumer education and behavior change versus business, governance, and manufacturer education and behavior change, and what percentage would cause a swing in change?
Yeah, the biggest is the manufacturers, unfortunately. To put it in perspective, fair trade. Most people are aware of fair trade. Now, fair trade bananas now make up 92% of all banana sales in the UK. It's rare to find non-fair trade bananas. Same with tea, same with coffee. It's just become standard. People choose that route. That was a groundswell for about 15 years. But the real big piece of change was two of the biggest supermarkets decided to exclusively sell just those products early. And that's what drove the behavioral change faster. IKEA right now is one of the few countries in the world that's got rid of incandescent, the old light bulbs. And they're actually skipping compact fluorescents, the eco bulbs, and they're going straight to LEDs. They're just offering only LEDs. What's interesting is IKEA took a massive hit on their light bulb sales when they did this, but it's now creeping back up again. So they're leading that behavioral change. Many people, even engineers I know, will sit in a house with completely inefficient systems. They have a cognitive disconnect. At work, work really hard on this, but at home, completely forget about it. I had a great conversation with a friend of mine who's an electrical engineer the other day about his stupid light bulbs. Like, what are you doing? You just complained to me about your electric bills, and you haven't lifted your eyes to the stupid heaters you have on your roof. And he's like, yeah, but it doesn't make cost-effective sense. I was like, yeah, you have about a 4.5-month payback. You know, and I said, look, I'm gonna hold your hand, walk down to the aisle, and just buy them, because there's just this laziness, you know. Humans, because of our cognitive dissonance, we believe something, but then we act a different way. When you confront human beings around cognitive dissonance, which is a really interesting piece of assessment that's been done all over the world many times, most humans would rather change their belief system and their behavior. So if you say, hey, I'm eco, I care about good stuff, and then you take them home and say, actually, look at all these bad things you're doing, most people would rather just adjust their beliefs instead of changing their behavior to come in line with their previous beliefs. So it's a challenge. When big corporates roll out brand new innovations and make them standard, they transition the economy fast. You're seeing this with electric cars. We are only a couple of years away from electric cars being the cheaper option in every regard. We are very shortly going to be in a position where driverless vehicles will wipe out ownership of cars for a lot of people in urban environments. And this is only 10, 15 years away. I was talking to Andrea Reimer, the deputy mayor, City of Vancouver, the other day about this, and I said, what scenario planning have you guys done around the impact of driverless cars to the value of property in cities? And she goes, what do you mean? I said, driverless cars are going to obliterate the value of property in cities. 15 years, I think 40% cuts. And she said, why? Because I can live in Chilliwack and go 250 kilometers per hour into work, and I can sleep in my car, do work in my car. Why the hell would I live in a $2 million apartment? It's just, there are things coming that are going to transition stuff so fast. But our governance is sitting there saying a $3.5 billion Massey tunnel replacement. Stupidity. Even the city of Coquitlam is trying to up the amount of parking requirements for new buildings. What? Did you know that 46% of 25-year-old and under people living in Vancouver don't have driver's licenses? 10 years ago, that was 15%. This is happening so fast that like our management system's just not adapting. What I loved about Andrea, she's like, I didn't think about that. I want to know more. That's the response. But most people, it's like, this is more interesting. I get this, you know. So it's interesting. Ultimately, we need to be controlled. And I hate to say it, but I don't know if democracy has any compatibility with our survival. Liberal governments have a view, and I think the best summary, and I'm not being anti-liberal or anti-conservative, I'm anti-them all, is that the best summary of a liberal government is a traffic police person standing in the middle of an intersection. Their job is to make sure the traffic keeps flowing. They have no regard for where it's going. Actually, no, we got to start managing where we're going. Where we're going is hell-bent on our own destruction. So it's unfortunate, but we now have to start controlling the worst aspects of ourselves. We should have done this over the last 40 years, but we didn't. We've sat pretty. So that's the circumstance. Yes, at the back.
I'm just wondering about the ecological environmental impact of a massive population growth in Chilliwack.
Well, that's where my dad lives. Yeah. It's starting to happen already. You know, you have in Chilliwack, the old Canadian Forces base is now going to be covered in houses. You know, there's a vast ecological impact on the local environment because, ironically, military bases are really good for biodiversity. They're excellent because they are usually left alone. Vast swathes of land.
Are not the solution.
No, that's right, but it's interesting. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Phil. Phil was next.
So would you say something about how the banking system we use is restricting our options in sustainability? And are there any countries that have invented the wheel again?
Yes, it's happened many times. In the early 1920s in Bavaria and Germany, inflation was hyper. They had 45, 50% inflation rates. The economy was in free fall. The Bavarian government decided to create their own local currency because the Deutschmark was killing them. And what they did was really intriguing. They invented a currency that was needed to be revalidated every year by the bank. It was a stamp, basically. Every stamp dropped the value of the currency by 5%. You didn't get a stamp, it's worth nothing. You get a stamp, it's worth 5% less every year. And the reason why they did that was a bunch of German economists realized the worst place we should be putting our money is in banks. We need to be spending our money on stuff, which gets the economy going. And that Bavarian example works so well that within 8 years, that section of Bavaria was in growth while the rest of Germany was in massive decline. Their inflation had dropped phenomenally, and the German government outlawed the currency. What was interesting, there's been examples of local currency all over the world that have worked really well. There's a thing called the local multiplier effect. LM3 is the model, which is that if you spend $1 on a business that's local, that employs local people and gets its products locally, versus a buck on a business that is local that buys something from somewhere else, versus $1 on a business that buys that thing from somewhere on the planet Earth way far away. The difference in impact of that same dollar, the Chinese model or distant European model, would drop down to about 23% impact. So $1 enters the economy, 23 cents of that stays here, the rest leaches out. If you do it with someone on the other side of Canada, you have about 80% of that money staying in the economy, 20% leaching out. If you do it with a company that's really, really, really local, it has a 2.7 times, 270% impact. So you start to look at that and go, that means $1 can be 23 cents of impact or $2.70 of impact. That same dollar. So $1 is not $1 is not $1. If you're not understanding all those variables, then you don't comprehend how much of your cash is leaching out of the economy. This is also why we are saying, oh, I go buy that cheap thing somewhere because it saves me money. It doesn't save you money. Most of the money goes out of the economy. It doesn't go into local taxation, into local employment, into local manufacturing. So we're in a position where we're not measuring ourselves very well. We can. We have tools and techniques within sustainable procurement that could measure everything and show you best value. You could walk into a store and see something that costs $1 and see a whole raft of other measures. Here's the economic impact. Here's the local economy benefit. Here's the social benefit. Here's the social return on investment. All of those measures could be there. And then you could say, oh, I'm going to choose that instead of that.
Sorry, what would you recommend that we do on Bowen Island to apply these principles to where we live and on the island?
What I think we really need to do in Bowen is to actually do some of these local multiplier assessments on our businesses and actually communicate it holistically as a community. Saying, guess what, you just bought a $20 pizza from Tuscany, this is the impact on the local economy, 46 bucks. That's what we need to communicate. I think we should set up a little standardized mechanism on the outside of restaurants and the outside of stores telling people this message. We need to just spend a little bit of money doing the assessments properly and getting them assured to make sure they're accurate, and then actually show everybody why buying something locally is really, really good for our economy. And in the end of the day, most of us drive off to Costco to do a big monthly shop because it's cheaper. It is, but most of those products don't come from here. You know, if you go to Walmart to buy that cheapo product that breaks every 3 months, it's not cheap. It costs us vast amounts. So it's about quantifying, and I think we should do that. But we need to do it in a way that is really simple, clear, and a great message. It'd be wonderful if there was some research grants available in Canada to do that. It is happening in Europe already. There's a town called Totnes in the UK that invented their own pound. And what they're trying to encourage is 70% of all transactions in the town are with Totnes pounds, because they all have a massive multiplier. There's an economist from Ireland called Richard Douthright. He said that everyone in the world should have two currencies. We should have a global currency, everyone the same, and we should have a local currency. And 75% of all of our spend should be with local, and 25% should be with the global currency. That's because he did all the assessments and showed this would be better for all of our economies. And it's interesting because what I find hilarious about Canadian dollar is 5% of our economy is from fossil fuels. Yet we have lost 20% of our currency value because of fossil fuels. I'm fine. Explain it to me. I don't see how that's practically possible or in any way legitimate. And the reason it isn't legitimate is because economics is a lie. It's fake, it's made up. Why is the US dollar still so powerful when they've been in deficit for 40 years? Because we all believe in it. It's nothing to do with reality.
Well, oil is traded in dollars.
It is, but that's a choice. And ironically, what's funny is the value of oil also has nothing to do with its impact. We haven't included that, incorporated into its value at all. So I just don't believe in economics, modern economics. I don't believe in modern finance. I think it's all lies. Well, how could you be a widget manufacturer that's been around for 100 years, and then a bunch of stockbrokers decide to sell your stocks off like crazy one day on the stock market, and you lose 50% of your economy value? Nothing to do with what you do. Come on, we can do better than this. We can design systems that are rational, and we don't have them. Yes?
A big picture question from a biologist. When I was going to university, there were books and talk about population. Human population,
yes.
And you don't hear a bloody thing about it now. And you know, and I talk to people who say, you know, if we stop eating cattle,
Yeah.
we'd solve a whole bunch of CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
And my point though is that's a major change in the way people live and that kind of thing. We're giving up we could be giving up a whole bunch of things by not facing the big biological problem is too many people.
Absolutely.
And
there's an
I don't
organization.
hear anything.
Well, check out the Optimum Population Trust. David Attenborough was one of the founders. Now, they are looking exactly that issue from all the different angles, because humans are the biggest challenge here. The more of us, the worse it gets. And what's really interesting about this is population levels need to be unfortunately controlled, but there is no government who will ever do that in the Western world. Nobody will ever tell you, I'm going to infringe on your freedoms, because if you do, you're voted out. So we don't therefore have a mechanism within politics to deal with this problem. When it comes to the meat issue, you're absolutely right. It's interesting because most of us grow up in environments where there was a Sunday roast. There wasn't a Monday through Sunday roast. We have transformed our meating radically in a very short period of time, and also food's become really cheap. Now about 15% of our disposable income goes towards food, whereas in medieval times, for an average peasant, it was 80%. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa right now, it's 65% of your income goes towards food. So we in the West are sitting with cheap, readily available food. And that's why we waste so much food. That's why we buy more than we need. That's why we overconsume. And those mechanisms all will change, either through system failure or through behavioral change. Unfortunately, there's no examples of behavioral change in our history, ever. It's always been system failure. Another analogy on this is right now the income disparity between the rich and the poor today in a place like Vancouver is no different than it was when we had medieval kings and knights and serfs. The difference is that our serfs have warm houses and they eat lots of food and they've got a widescreen TV. So ironically, our serfs today are living like kings. But the income disparity is just as wide. And throughout human history, whenever that income disparity ever arises, it's always, every single time, leads to revolution or collapse. Never anything else, because unfortunately the elites of our world do not hand over power. They hold on to it until it falls apart. And our 0.1% now are largely, roughly 70% behind where the world's going. And that's our problem. It's about short-term gain. I mean, just look at how many decisions are being made with our leaders, which are all about now. Kinder Morgan, LNG, these are just short-term gain. And I don't know how to manage this situation, because you can revolt and get angry, and if Kinder Morgan goes through, which I have an 80% belief it will, the only thing that would ever change anything is thousands of people getting arrested. Because under Canadian law, if over 1,000 Canadians are arrested because of civil disobedience, we have an aspect of our Constitution which requires a referendum. So no government will ever let 1,000 people get arrested for anything. Remember Clayoquot Sound? When I was there in the early 90s, mid-90s, I was watching police cars getting smashed up by people with hammers, and the police were doing nothing. They stopped arresting. The reality here is that that's all we have left for management, is to say no and just stop everything. But we're lazy. You know, really, I mean, Standing Rock is an interesting example. Brilliant example of people coming together and saying enough, this is stupid. Now what's interesting is mainstream media is still not covering it. Fringe media is still covering it. Nothing much changing, but it's building a momentum. And that's the only thing that's going to change things, is radical civil disobedience. Yes?
I would like to know the sources that you put Andrea Reimer onto. Where should we look online for the best, latest info?
Oh, there's so many places.
Well, that's what, the top 3.
Is it listed on Carbon Free Group?
No, it's not. There's so many. It depends what's...
What's your Andrea Reimer?
Well, I told Andrea to hire me so I could tell her the answers. Yeah, I have to live in Vancouver. It's funny because there is a beautiful piece of work around driverless cars and their impact that came out of the city of Toronto. One of the urban planners in the city of Toronto wrote a report about this, and I think her report is the best in the world.
Okay.
She's just said, this is what I think is going to happen, 40% drop in property prices.
Okay.
It depends, ask me on the side for other sources of news, but what I would say is mainstream media is useless for anything other than banal information. Somebody asked me the other day, what do I look at regularly? And I mix and match. I use Russian television for wonderful news about anywhere other than Russia or Russian interests, because they're completely biased. Al Jazeera is excellent for anything other than Middle East. It's about using pieces to look at it. CBC, rubbish, sorry to say it. BBC has become pretty bad. American media, abysmal. Some of the worst in the world. So we have to find ways of finding out the truth. And that means looking at the story from a number of perspectives and going, okay, this is what I think is happening.
I'll go on Facebook and follow see what you follow.
Sure, excellent.
Thank you.
We're kind of out of time. Okay.
You can ask me on the side.
You can ask. Thank you very much for the interest.